December 22nd, 1944. Somewhere outside Bastogne, Belgium. The snow came down like ash, silent and relentless. Through the haze of artillery smoke, a column of exhausted German infantry stumbled down a dirt road, hands raised, rifles discarded in the slush. Sergeant Karl Weber, 21, once proud of his Wehrmacht uniform, now walked with torn gloves and a bandaged knee, his breath freezing in short bursts. American jeeps idled on the roadside, their .50 caliber Brownings pointed skyward but ready. A group of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, faces smeared with mud and frost, waved the prisoners toward a collection point. "Keep moving, Krauts!" one of them barked, though not with hatred, just weariness. They'd seen enough death for 10 lifetimes that month. Weber glanced at the soldiers' rations dangling from their belts, cans of Spam, chocolate bars, real bread. His stomach ached. For the past week, he and his unit had survived on frozen turnips and melted snow. He remembered the propaganda back home, posters of skeletal British POWs in chains, captions reading, "So the enemy treats our men." Now, seeing the Americans' discipline, the lack of cruelty, he began to wonder if Berlin had lied. That night, the prisoners were loaded into olive green trucks marked U.S. Army Transportation Corps. The convoy snaked through what remained of the Ardennes. Shellfire rumbled somewhere in the east, echoing across the forest like distant thunder. Hours later, they reached a rail depot under Allied control. Searchlights swept the scene, long lines of German prisoners boarding freight cars under watchful guards. Weber climbed aboard, pressed shoulder to shoulder with men from every corner of the Reich. The air smelled of damp wool and fear. No one spoke for hours until an older soldier muttered, "They'll starve us. You'll see. Americans smile now, but we'll die in their camps." Weber wasn't sure he believed him anymore. The journey west took days. Rations were meager, bread, stew, sometimes coffee, but it was still more than they'd had in weeks. The guards didn't beat them, didn't shout except to give orders. They even passed out cigarettes. Weber kept one, unlit as a kind of relic, proof that perhaps not every enemy was a monster. When the train finally stopped, the men were herded out into a bitter dawn. The sign overhead read simply, "Le Havre Staging Area." Ahead, docked in the mist, loomed a gray troopship, the USS Wakefield. An American officer with a clipboard shouted, "All prisoners will be processed and shipped to the United States. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means food, work, and medical care. You behave, you'll be fine." A murmur rippled through the ranks. The United States? None of them had believed they'd actually be sent across the ocean. For Weber, the idea was unimaginable. His father had fought in the Great War, speaking of America as a place of chaos and greed. Yet here he was, about to be fed, housed, and perhaps even spared. As the ship's horn bellowed and the shoreline of Europe receded, Weber stood on deck, wind biting his face, staring toward the gray horizon. Behind him, men whispered about submarines and stormy seas. But beneath the fear, a strange thought crept in. Maybe captivity would be better than the front. Below deck, the POWs were given wool blankets, hot soup, and even a piece of apple pie from the ship's galley. The taste was foreign, sweet and warm. Weber ate slowly, eyes wide. In his diary that night, he wrote, "The Americans feed us like guests. If this is prison, then war is madness." January 18th, 1945, Hampton Roads, Virginia. The USS Wakefield slid into port under a pale winter sun, its hull streaked with Atlantic salt. As the gangplank dropped, the first wave of German prisoners blinked against the brightness of America. They'd expected something harsher, cold stares, jeers, maybe even cages. Instead, they saw rows of military trucks, Red Cross nurses handing out water, and American soldiers leaning casually against jeeps, chewing gum. Sergeant Karl Weber clutched his duffel, eyes scanning the skyline, smokestacks, cranes, and the distant flutter of a U.S. flag. For the first time in years, he heard no sirens, no air raid alerts, no thunder of guns, just the steady hum of machinery and seagulls. The prisoners were marched onto waiting trains marked U.S. Army Transport Service. Through the windows, the countryside blurred past, farms, silos, wooden fences, and people waving from porches. Children waved too, not mockingly, but curiously, as if they were seeing ghosts from another world. "America," whispered one of the older men beside him. "Clean, no rubble, no bomb craters." The train rumbled westward for days, deeper into the heart of the United States. Each morning, MPs brought trays through the cars, eggs, toast, real butter, and coffee so strong it made Weber's head spin. None of it made sense. One evening, an American sergeant passed down the aisle speaking in slow, clear English. You follow rules, you get food, mail, maybe even work. Geneva Convention. You know that? A few men nodded. The sergeant smiled faintly. Good. You treat us decent, we'll treat you decent. When the train finally stopped, Weber stepped out into the soft light of Texas dawn. A wooden sign loomed overhead. Camp Hearn, Texas. U.S. Army prisoner of war. Camp. Inside, the camp stretched for acres. Barracks, mess halls, baseball fields, even a small library. The air smelled faintly of pine and roasting meat. American guards stood watch from the towers, but their posture was relaxed, almost bored. Weber expected barbed wire and brutality. Instead, he saw men walking freely within the perimeter, chatting, smoking, even tending vegetable gardens. At registration, each prisoner received a canvas cot, 2 blankets, and a metal plate. A corporal explained through an interpreter, "You'll work when assigned, you'll be paid in canteen coupons, you can buy cigarettes, soap, even candy. No trouble, no punishment." It sounded absurd. That evening, Weber and his barrack mates lined up for their first dinner. Inside the mess hall, long tables stretched beneath hanging lamps. The smell was intoxicating. Roast beef, potatoes, gravy. When Weber reached the counter, an American cook, sleeves rolled up, grinned. "Next." Weber hesitated, then handed over his tray. The cook scooped a generous helping of meat and vegetables, then added, almost ceremoniously, a scoop of vanilla ice cream on a separate dish. Weber froze. "Eyes?" he asked, bewildered. "Yeah," the cook said, smiling. "Ice cream. Welcome to Texas, pal." Laughter rippled through the line. Weber carried his tray to the table, sat, and stared at the white mound melting beside his meal. Ice cream. In January. For prisoners. He took a spoonful, then another. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. One whispered, "Back home. My children haven't seen meat in a year." Another replied softly, "We are eating better than the Reich itself." After dinner, guards allowed them to write letters. Weber's hand trembled as he scribbled beneath the red censor's stamp. "Mother, I am safe. The Americans feed us like kings. Do not believe what you are told. They are not the monsters from the radio." The camp lights flickered off at 2000 hours. Crickets sang in the dark, the air warm and still. For the first night in months, Weber slept without fear of artillery or air raids. Somewhere outside, the stars and stripes flapped lazily against the tower. And for a moment, even a captured German sergeant felt a strange, impossible thing. Peace. March 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The Texas spring came early that year. By March, the red clay around Camp Hearn had dried to dust, and the mesquite trees shimmered under the sun. Inside the wire, life had settled into rhythm. Reveille at dawn, roll call, then breakfast thick with the smell of bacon and black coffee. For Sergeant Carl Weber and the others, the days had taken on an almost surreal normality. They worked in small labor details, cutting lumber, repairing fences, or harvesting crops on nearby farms. The Americans paid them 50 cents a day in canteen coupons redeemable for cigarettes, postcards, or Coca-Cola. Some of the men even began learning English, trading phrases with the guards. "Good morning, Joe," one prisoner would call with a grin. "Morgen, Fritz," the guard would shout back, tipping his helmet. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it wasn't hatred anymore either. At mealtimes, the smell of food drew every man from his bunk. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, even stewed peaches. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the same rations as the captors' troops, and the Americans, to the letter of the law, obeyed. But in 1945, when food across Europe was rationed and cities lay in ruin, that law seemed almost indulgent. One night, after a Sunday dinner, Weber sat outside the barracks writing in his diary. Around him, laughter drifted from the mess hall. Someone was playing an accordion, others singing old folk tunes. He wrote, "It is strange to feel human again. I remember marching through France, hungry and cold, thinking I was the conqueror of nations. Now, behind this wire, I am a prisoner. Yet I eat better, sleep better, even think more clearly. Perhaps we were never the masters we believed ourselves to be." Nearby, another prisoner, Private Dieter Schultz, showed off a letter from home. The paper was thin and trembling with age. "My wife writes that Berlin has no bread," he said, voice cracking. "She says she boils potatoes for the children, nothing more. And here," he gestured toward the mess hall, where an American cook poured coffee for a line of prisoners. "Here, they feed us like we are guests." Weber looked down. The guilt was sharp, almost unbearable. Rumors spread that the War Department had ordered inspections to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention. Officers from Washington toured the camps, clipboards in hand, making notes on sanitation, rations, and discipline. The Americans were meticulous. Prisoners had to be treated with dignity, or the commandant risked reprimand. Still, some of the Germans couldn't accept it. At night, in whispers, a few die-hard Nazi loyalists muttered that it was all a trick. Propaganda meant to break them, to make them forget who they were. Weber had once believed that too. Now, he wasn't so sure. One afternoon, his work detail was sent to a nearby farm. The landowner, a quiet man in his 50s, greeted them with a nod and a pitcher of iced tea. As they dug irrigation trenches, he handed out sandwiches, thick with ham and mustard. "Never thought I'd see the day I'd feed Germans on my land," the farmer said with a half smile. "But you boys work hard. War's a fool's game anyway." That night, Weber stared at the ceiling of his barrack, replaying the man's words. A fool's game. Maybe the farmer was right. As the weeks passed, spring deepened into summer. The camp gardens bloomed, tended by prisoners who took pride in coaxing life from the dry soil. Some painted murals on the barracks walls, pastoral scenes, mountains, villages untouched by war. A few even staged plays and orchestras, complete with makeshift costumes and violins carved from scrap wood. The Americans watched with quiet curiosity. A few guards admitted the truth aloud. "You wouldn't believe these fellas fought for Hitler. They're polite, clean, like they're trying to make up for something." By July, letters from home grew darker. Cities in ashes, fathers lost, mothers starving. The men read them in silence, the joy of American meals turning bitter in their mouths. Then, one humid evening, a guard switched on the camp's loudspeaker and made an announcement that froze every man in place. "Attention all prisoners. Allied forces have entered Berlin. The war in Europe is nearly over." The cheers never came, just silence and the faint hum of cicadas outside the wire. Weber closed his eyes. He thought of his mother, of the bombed-out streets of his childhood city, of the millions who would never see the strange, merciful place called Texas. In his diary, he wrote only one line that night. "We lost the war long before we lost the battle." August 15th, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The air shimmered with heat that day, thick and humming with insects. The POWs were working in the fields when the sound of a distant siren echoed from the camp. Not an alarm, but a call to assembly. The guards waved them back toward the gate, faces unreadable. In the mess yard, hundreds of prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the blistering Texas sun. Captain James B. Montgomery, the camp commandant, climbed a small wooden platform, his uniform immaculate despite the sweat. He removed his cap and spoke in a steady, deliberate tone. "Gentlemen," he began, his southern drawl measured, "the war is over. Germany surrendered in May, and today Japan has done the same. The world is at peace again." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Disbelief, then quiet. For the first time in years, there was no enemy, no front, no orders, just the vast silence of what came next. Weber felt it like a physical blow. For months, he had lived as a prisoner, but also, strangely, as a human being again. Now that the war was over, freedom loomed, and with it the question he feared most: what was left to return to? That night, as fireworks boomed from a nearby town celebrating victory, the camp was silent. No music, no laughter, just the rustle of wind through the barracks. Inside, Weber and a few others sat at a wooden table, their tin cups of coffee untouched. Schultz broke the silence first. "They will send us home soon," he said. "Back to nothing." Another man, Lieutenant Ernst Vogel, shook his head. "To ruins. My brother wrote last month. Our village doesn't exist anymore." Weber stared at his reflection in the coffee's surface. He'd thought of America as the enemy once. Faceless, mechanical, merciless. Now looking around the barrack, at the clean beds, the library shelves, the sound of guards chatting outside, he realized something unthinkable. The Americans had treated them better than their own leaders ever had. The next morning, the camp buzzed with a strange energy. Trucks arrived carrying new supplies, food, medicine, newspapers. The Americans seemed almost relieved themselves. Guards no longer barked orders, they joked with the prisoners. "Looks like you boys will be heading home soon," one said, tossing Weber a cigarette. Weber lit it and nodded. "Maybe," he replied in halting English. "But where is home now?" The guard didn't answer. Over the following weeks, the camp changed. The strict roll calls became shorter. Work details were relaxed. Prisoners walked more freely within the wire, some even helping rebuild nearby farms devastated by wartime shortages. One afternoon, a group of POWs was invited to a local church picnic, an act that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The townspeople served fried chicken, corn on the cob, and slices of watermelon under white tents. Children stared at the Germans with wide eyes, then slowly smiled. By evening, someone produced a fiddle, and laughter filled the air. When Weber returned to camp that night, he wrote, "Today I ate beside Americans. We were not enemies, not even prisoners, just men with hunger and sunburn and hope. But for all the kindness, the prisoners were haunted by guilt. Rumors of concentration camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, began to reach them through American newspapers. The photographs circulated in stunned silence. Skeletal figures, mountains of corpses, eyes that seemed to pierce the paper itself." Vogel slammed his fist on the table. "It's lies, it must be!" No one answered him. Weber simply stared, his stomach hollow. Could the same nation that raised him, the same flag he'd saluted since boyhood, have done this? That night, he didn't sleep. The next day, he volunteered for extra work, helping clean the camp's infirmary just to stay busy. But the images wouldn't leave his mind. Weeks later, a Red Cross representative visited the camp to brief the men on repatriation. They would be processed, given food, and shipped back to Europe in phases. Before leaving, he told them something that struck Weber like a thunderclap. "Some of you will go home to American-occupied Germany. You'll help rebuild what your leaders destroyed. You'll show them how men are supposed to treat one another." As the camp prepared for departure, the prisoners received one last meal: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. Weber sat quietly, savoring each bite. Across the table, Schultz smiled faintly. "They feed us like it's Christmas," he said. Weber nodded. "Maybe it is." When the final roll call came, Weber stood at attention, his uniform freshly washed, his belongings packed. As the trucks rolled out toward the train station, he looked back once at the camp that had been his prison, and, in a strange way, his refuge. The guard at the gate saluted as they passed. Weber raised his hand in return. For the first time in years, he felt both free and lost. He would write one last line before the ship home left the harbor. "I came here as an enemy. I leave as a witness into a kind of decency I did not know mankind still possessed." November 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. The fog hung heavy over the harbor, gray and thick as smoke. The ship's horn bellowed once, echoing across the ruins of the port. Hundreds of men lined the deck, German prisoners no more, but not yet civilians either. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by simple work clothes stamped U.S. Repatriation Service. Sergeant Carl Weber stood at the railing, the salt wind cutting through his coat. For nearly 2 years, America had been his world. Its vast fields, clean barracks, steaming coffee, and quiet, unhurried kindness. Now, as the coastline of Germany took shape through the fog, a cold realization settled in his chest. This was home, and yet it wasn't. The docks came into view, piles of rubble, twisted cranes, skeletons of warehouses. American military jeeps rolled through the wreckage. Children in rags waved from the shoreline, their faces thin, eyes too old for their years. Weber stepped onto German soil again, boots crunching over broken glass. Around him, other repatriated POWs murmured in disbelief. One whispered, This can't be Bremen." Another added softly, "It's like the moon." Red Cross officers guided them to processing tents. They received ration cards, instructions, and warnings. "Do not discuss your treatment in the United States in public. Many have lost everything. They will not understand." Weber folded the card into his pocket, feeling its weight like a secret. A young interpreter with an American accent called out names for transport assignments. Weber, Carl, assigned to Hanover Sector. Report to Truck 3. The road inland wound through desolation, towns burned to the foundation, forests stripped for firewood, ghostly silhouettes of churches without roofs. Weber stared silently out the window. When they passed a group of civilians scavenging in the ruins, he recognized one of the faces, an older woman, thin, her shawl pulled tight. His heart stopped. "Mutter!" The truck braked sharply as Weber leapt down, stumbling toward her. She turned, eyes wide, then filled with tears. "Carl." She dropped the bundle she was carrying and ran to him. For a moment, the world fell away. No wire, no uniforms, no war. Just a mother clutching the son she thought dead. They wept in the ruins of what had once been their home. Inside what remained of their house, half a wall, a stove, and a patched roof of tin, Weber learned the rest. His father had died during an air raid in '44. His younger sister was missing, likely in Berlin. Food was scarce. Neighbors bartered rations for coal, soap, anything of value. That night, as his mother boiled a thin broth of turnips, Weber placed a small package on the table, a single tin of Spam, the last from his journey. She stared at it as if it were gold. "From America," she whispered. "Yes," he said quietly. "They gave us plenty." She hesitated, then asked the question he had dreaded most. "Is it true, Carl? The camps? The things they say the Nazis did?" Weber didn't answer immediately. He He looked into the fire, remembering the newspaper photographs, the skeletal faces, the silence in Camp Hearn when they first saw the truth. Finally, he said, "Yes, Mother, it's true." The words hung heavy in the small room. She wept softly, hands over her face. Weber could offer no comfort, only truth, and the faint, flickering memory of decency he had seen in the men who were once his enemies. In the months that followed, Weber worked clearing debris for the Allied reconstruction crews. The American soldiers overseeing the effort greeted him politely. Once, one offered him a cup of coffee, black, steaming, strong, the same taste that had greeted him on his first morning in Texas. Weber smiled faintly. "You people and your coffee," he said. The soldier grinned. "It gets us through the day." By 1947, Weber was a different man. He kept a small notebook, his old POW diary, hidden beneath his mattress. In it, he wrote not of battles, but of breakfasts, of music, of kindness. "If we rebuild Germany," one entry read, "let it be built not from pride, but from mercy. Let our children learn not from conquest, but from the way the Americans fed their prisoners." Years later, that notebook would find its way into the hands of a historian documenting POW experiences in the U.S. The historian would be stunned by the vividness, the food, the laughter, the ice cream. But it was the final line that would stay with him most. "They gave us bread when we deserved none, and in doing so, they fed something deeper than hunger." 1955, Kassel, West Germany. A soft rain fell over the rebuilt city, pattering against the cobblestones that once lay buried under rubble. The air smelled faintly of wet brick and diesel, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled, not for morning, but for morning. Karl Weber, now 41, walked down Friedrichsplatz with a worn satchel under his arm. His hair had thinned and silvered at the temples, but his stride remained steady. He was a teacher now, a man who spent his days not with rifles or ration lines, but with chalk and curious young faces. Inside his classroom, a dozen children sat at their desks, their post-war hunger for understanding far greater than any physical want. They had been born after the collapse, after the bombs, the surrender, the shame. For them, the war was a story told in photographs and whispers. Weber began his lesson quietly. On the blackboard, he wrote two words: Menschlichkeit and humanity. Turning to his students, he asked, "Do you know what this means?" A girl raised her hand. "It means to be human, sir?" "Yes," Weber said softly. "But not everyone remembers what that means." He told them about the camps, not the ones in Germany, but the ones in America, about Texas, and how behind the barbed wire he had discovered something his own nation had forgotten. He described the meals: roast beef, potatoes, ice cream on Sundays, the guards who treated them with respect, the farmers who handed them cold water in the heat. The children listened in stunned silence. One boy finally asked, "But why would they do that? We were the enemy." Weber smiled sadly. "Because they understood something our leaders did not, that decency is not weakness. Mercy can win a war more completely than any weapon." Outside, the rain eased, the sound of it softening against the window panes. He continued, "When I returned home, I saw our cities in ashes, but the Americans, they gave us food, medicine, even care. They wanted us to live, not to suffer. I think that is why we stand here today, in a school instead of a ruin." He paused, then took a small notebook from his satchel, its edges frayed, its pages yellowing with age. "This is the diary I kept in captivity," he said. "I wrote in it every night. Would you like to hear something?" The class nodded eagerly. Weber opened to a familiar page, his handwriting faded but clear. He read aloud, voice trembling slightly. "March 12th, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The Americans served us stew and coffee. I spoke with a guard named Miller. He said, 'Maybe someday you'll remember this and teach your children something better.' I laughed then, but now I think maybe he was right." When he looked up, the children were silent. One girl finally whispered, "Did you ever find that guard again?" Weber shook his head. "No, but I still hear his words. Every time I see you, every time I teach." After class, Weber walked through the schoolyard, past rows of new bicycles and freshly planted trees. Germany was changing. So much of what was broken had been rebuilt, but the real reconstruction, he thought, had taken place inside men's hearts. That evening, he returned home to his modest apartment overlooking the Fulda River. His mother had long since passed, but her photograph sat on the windowsill beside a small American coffee tin he had kept all these years. He brewed a cup, dark, strong, the way he'd learned in Texas, and sat by the window as dusk settled over the city. From the radio, a familiar tune began to play, a slow, melancholy rendition of Lily Marlene. He smiled faintly. "Some things never change," he murmured. As the music drifted through the room, Weber opened his diary once more and penned a final reflection. 10 years have passed since I left that camp in Texas. I have seen my country rise again, humbler, wiser, perhaps kinder. The Americans fed us food, but more than that, they fed us conscience. If there is any hope for mankind, it begins not with vengeance, but with compassion, even toward the defeated. He closed the diary, blew out the lamp, and let the quiet fill the room. Far across the ocean, the old camp at Hearn still stood, its fences rusted, its barracks reclaimed by weeds. But in that place, once filled with the weary and the broken, something rare had taken root. Not victory, not defeat, but humanity